Late on May 1, 1982, at 16:10, Captain Gustavo Garcia Cuerva flies over West Falkland at about 11 kilometers, heading into an interception already warped by decisions made long before takeoff. The South Atlantic lies gray under him, and the sky over his canopy has the color of cold steel. He is 34, an Argentine Air Force captain from Mariano Moreno in a Mirage III EA interceptor. On paper, the Mirage has the edge. He has altitude. He has speed. Carlos Perona keeps station off his right wing, and Cuerva carries almost 10 years of training meant for another war. In a textbook intercept, those are the terms he wants. He trained for Chile, for high interception over the Andes, and for a fast fight far above the ground. None of it prepared him for this. Now he has to look down. 2 Royal Navy Sea Harriers are somewhere below the cloud deck, and the strengths of his aircraft stop matching the problem in front of him. Below the clouds, height stops being certainty. A pilot prepared for high, clean interceptions now has to hunt low over water, where speed gives less warning and less room. The islands have pulled an interceptor into a kind of battle it was never meant to lead. About 12 minutes later, Cuerva is damaged, short of fuel, and trying to get back to Port Stanley. His body is never found. At Port Stanley, Argentine anti-aircraft gunners mistake his Mirage for a British aircraft and shoot him down. That mistaken fire closed Cuerva's mission. It did not explain the scoreboard. Books and documentaries keep pointing to VIFing, the nozzle move in forward flight that supposedly made a Sea Harrier stop and let an Argentine pilot slide past. It is a neat legend. The numbers do not support it. Over 10 weeks, 28 Sea Harriers faced roughly 200 Argentine combat aircraft and finished with 20 kills against no Sea Harrier lost to another aircraft. That margin matters because the Argentines were not weak. They were not careless, and they were not poorly trained. The Mirage III looked stronger on paper, and Argentine pilots trained in part with Israeli veterans of the Six-Day War and the Yom Kippur War. Lieutenant Carlos Rinke later said he gave himself a 50-50 chance of getting back from a strike mission against the fleet. He flew anyway. Most of them did. So the cause sits outside the airframe, not in one dramatic turn, in the missile, the radar, the training syllabus, the islands, and in years of decisions made before anyone expected this war. The Sea Harrier carried the AIM-9 Lima, an all-aspect missile that widened the shot British pilots could take. Its Blue Fox radar helped crews find contacts over water and low cloud before a close merge decided everything. Many Argentine pilots never saw a clever trick. They saw a missile first, or found empty sky where the target should have been. That is why the tally matters more than the legend. Mirage speed did not settle it. Courage did not settle it either. Over 10 weeks of airfighting, the British logged 20 victories, and no other aircraft shot down a Sea Harrier. That tally sent the answer out of 1982 and back to October 1966. In that month, the Royal Navy learned it would get no new strike carriers. Harold Wilson's Labour government canceled CVA-01 after about a decade of design work. The message was blunt. Naval fixed-wing aviation was supposed to shrink away. The Royal Air Force would take air defense at sea. Old carriers would leave service and not be replaced. The Navy did not accept that verdict. It stopped arguing in public and started protecting the deck by other means. Through the late 1960s and into the 70s, admirals pushed ships called through-deck cruisers. The label mattered. It avoided the politically dangerous word carrier while preserving the one thing a Sea Harrier needed: a deck at sea. At the same time, money kept moving toward a small Hawker Siddeley jump jet, the P-1127. That aircraft became Kestrel, then Harrier. Then, in 1980, a naval version with a bubble canopy and the small Blue Fox radar entered service. Sea Harrier FRS-1 arrived 2 years before the war. That 2-year head start mattered. Before the war, the jet that looked weak on paper had already spent years in hard training fights against faster aircraft. At altitude, Sea Harrier FRS-1 reached about 1,300 kilometers per hour, roughly half a Mirage. It carried only 2 air-to-air missiles, and in clear weather its radar saw a target at about 32 kilometers. FRS meant fighter, reconnaissance, and strike, so one aircraft had to cover 3 jobs. American F-4 Phantom pilots laughed at first. Then they stopped. Tim Gedge later said Sea Harrier had flown against almost every Western aircraft, and the record supports him. Royal Navy crews trained against United States Air Force F-5 aggressors, F-15s from Bitburg, French Mirages, and German F-4s. They also practiced bomber intercepts between Iceland and the Faroe Islands. Before the war, they were already flying at night over the North Sea in weather that grounded civilian aviation. Those foul-weather sorties had one driver aboard HMS Invincible, Nigel "Sharky" Ward. By 1982, he was the most experienced Sea Harrier pilot in the world. He had already flown 3 operational tours, commanded 800 Naval Air Squadron, and now led 801 on the carrier. He argued with admirals, argued with the Royal Air Force, and then took the aircraft up to test the argument himself. The record backed him. At Decimo Manu in Sardinia, his pilots scored 26 kills to 10 against F-5 aggressors. Against F-15s, they scored 7 to 1. That was not luck. At low and medium altitude, the Sea Harrier could turn tighter than almost any fighter it met, and the Pegasus nozzles gave Ward an extra layer of thrust control. He took that edge and turned it into a routine. Then he drilled it. He ran Blue Fox by Ferranti at night, in cloud, and against low targets until the sequence became automatic. Other officers thought he pushed the radar work too far. Ward treating it as the price of getting the first contact. In a dark cockpit, the screen flashed green and a low blip appeared near the horizon. By the time the war began, his pilots could seize that contact almost the second it climbed above the sea. That quick intercept still needed the right weapon. The next factor changed the firing geometry itself, the AIM-9 Lima Sidewinder. Engineers developed it at China Lake in California. By the Falklands War, it was one of the newest Western close-range missiles and already sat in American stockpiles. Older Sidewinders imposed a strict rule: get behind the target first. AIM-9 Bravo, AIM-9 Delta, and AIM-9 Gulf were rear aspect missiles. They followed the hot exhaust plume, so a pilot had to reach the enemy's tail before launch. That limit shaped the geometry of jet combat through the 60s and 70s. AIM-9 Lima broke that geometry. It was the first production all-aspect Sidewinder. Its seeker used argon cooling down to liquid nitrogen temperature, which let it detect heat from airframe friction, not only from the engine jet. It could pull up to 35 G and held its track better against flares and other countermeasures. Against a head-on or crossing target, the Sea Harrier could lock and fire before sliding into the tail, which cut the Argentine pilot's time to turn or escape. That new firing angle mattered only if Britain had missiles to spend. On April 5, 1982, the task force left Portsmouth with just 19 AIM-9Ls aboard, a thin reserve for a campaign against more than 200 Argentine combat aircraft on paper. Washington had stayed neutral until then, but the United States opened its stockpiles, and Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger personally cleared an emergency transfer. Aircraft carried the missiles to Ascension Island, the main staging post on the South Atlantic route, and crews passed the boxes on to the British. John Lehman later recalled Ronald Reagan's instruction in blunt terms: give Margaret Thatcher what she needed to continue the war. Through ascension, Britain received about 100 more AIM-9Ls at $48,600 per missile. Those emergency missile stocks met the enemy almost at once. The first combat returns showed that Argentine evasion belonged to an older missile war. Pilots had trained for rear aspect shots, so they broke away from the cone behind the attacker and trusted that move to clear the danger. Everything from the intercept to the escape turn followed that rule. The change was simple. AIM-9L could take shots from angles older training treated as safe, and that stripped value from the standard break. Captain Pablo Carballo later said his Skyhawks had no radar warning receiver, so many crews had no sign that a missile was already in the air. They often learned about the launch only at impact. That mattered before any argument about pilot skill. The British no longer needed a perfect stern setup before firing. That cut the warning window down even further, and a maneuver built to defeat older seekers could waste the only seconds the pilot had. The tactic survived in training. It failed in combat. Sea Harriers fired 24 AIM-9L Sidewinders during the war. 21 hit their target. That is an 88% result against maneuvering aircraft, not a range figure and not a scripted test. A pilot could leave the rear cone and still remain inside the kill envelope. The blind spot reached beyond one squadron. Argentine fighters did carry modern weapons of their own, Israeli-built Harrier II missiles on daggers and Matra Magic missiles on Mirage III interceptors. Their problem was not an empty pylon. Their problem was a picture of missile combat that no longer matched the fight over the islands. 21 of 24 launches hit their target. That missile shock exposed a harder limit than tactics. By the time a Mirage III reached the islands, it carried only about 15 minutes over the combat area. That figure assumed ideal conditions, 3 external fuel tanks, and a descent from altitude to meet a low-flying Sea Harrier. The margin was already gone. Once the pilot came down and started maneuvering, fuel for the fight collapsed to 2 or 3 turns. Speed and altitude still mattered, but they no longer gave the pilot room to choose. The route explains the problem in plain numbers. Rio Grande to Port Stanley meant about 704 kilometers. Rio Gallegos stretched that to about 806, San Julian to about 787, and Comodoro Rivadavia to about 889. 3 tanks bought only minutes. Argentina had built these fighters for short-range interception near the mainland, where a pilot climbed, engaged, and landed with home close behind him. Over the South Atlantic, the same aircraft crossed open water, arrived at the edge of its endurance, and entered combat with almost no reserve left. That changed every decision in the cockpit. There was no fuel for a second pass, no fuel to chase, and no fuel to stay high until the picture became clear. The mission was a countdown. Argentine fighters had no way to take fuel in the air, and the whole Air Force and Navy together shared only 2 KC-130 tankers. The Mirages and daggers could not use them anyway, so they flew out at the limit, fought at the limit, and turned home at the limit. Some did not get back. After 2 or 3 turns, the pilot had to break away for the mainland, or fuel ran out over the South Atlantic. While Argentine crews were already calculating the return leg, Hermes deck crews were already turning another jet for patrol. That mattered as much as the missile. The Sea Harrier kept flying. Across the 10-week campaign, the embarked Sea Harrier force held all-up serviceability above 90%. Commander Tim Gedge of 809 Naval Air Squadron put mission serviceability at about 98%. His squadron flew nearly 1,500 sorties. Hermes Sea Harriers alone flew more than 1,100. That pace held through the South Atlantic winter, at sea, with salt spray, wet decks, and cold rain around the maintenance teams. It was no accident. The aircraft was small and simple, designed years earlier for a small group of sailors on a small ship in bad weather. That choice cut maintenance time and kept the same airframes returning to patrol over the fleet. At peak tempo, one Sea Harrier went up 4 times in a day. That turnaround rate forced a decision on the Argentine side. While British Sea Harriers kept returning over the fleet, Argentine commanders ran into a limit they could not remove with speed or pilot quality. Their Mirages, Daggers, and Skyhawks were good aircraft, but the force had been built for continental flying from large bases with deep maintenance support and steadier weather. Against jets the British could send back up in about 15 minutes under freezing rain. Argentina could not generate a similar sortie rate. The limit was fuel. After the losses of the 1st of May, Brigadier Ernesto Crespo removed the Mirage fighters from offensive operations over the islands. He concluded that the Mirage could not win air superiority above the Falklands inside its fuel envelope. That decision pushed the war in one direction, because once the fast interceptors left the main contest, the fight dropped lower and the pressure shifted onto strike aircraft. By the second week, the Argentine Air Force had given up the air-to-air battle. The remaining roles were narrowed fast. Dagger and Skyhawk units kept flying, but only against the British fleet, not in fighter sweeps against the Harriers. The older Canberra bombers were limited to night sorties when darkness offered at least some cover on the approach. Argentina still had aircraft and trained crews, but it no longer had a workable plan to control the sky over the islands. The Mirages went back to the mainland to defend Buenos Aires from a British strike that never came. That retreat exposed the real problem. Britain kept the fight low over the water, and in that narrow band of altitude, the staff picture in Buenos Aires began to break. On paper, the Argentine case was solid. Mirage III was faster than the Sea Harrier, Argentine pilots were judged no worse than British pilots, and the numbers around the task force ran to roughly 5-1. Those were not fantasies, but they belonged to the wrong fight. Brigadier Crespo said so after the war, in interviews that read more like an audit than an excuse. His Mirages were delta-wing interceptors built to climb fast and fight high, and the British never offered that target. Sea Harriers stayed between 600 and 1,200 meters above the sea, where the Mirage lost its energy margin and every maneuver burned fuel it could not spare. Against the cold water below, the Sidewinder Seekers saw a cleaner target, and the AIM-9 Lima could attack from the front as well as the rear. The British did not need to outrun the Mirage. They only had to keep the battle where Mirage speed bought less and fuel cost more. By the time Argentine commanders grasped that, they dropped the air superiority mission and shifted their surviving effort to low-level strikes against the fleet. Once the high fight failed them, Argentine aviation dropped to wave height and aimed straight at the fleet. Skyhawks and Daggers came in only 6 to 15 meters above the sea, below the radar horizon and below the Sea Harrier patrols. Flying that low kept them under ship radar until the last approach and under the fighters meant to cut them off. That profile got them through. It also set the price. They hit ships, and they hit many. HMS Sheffield went down, then HMS Coventry, HMS Ardent, and HMS Antelope. Atlantic Conveyor and Sir Galahad were lost as well, while other British ships took damage and stayed afloat. They kept coming. Captain Carlos Rinker called 50% losses arithmetic, not panic. The reason was simple and lethal. At that height, a split second of distraction put a pilot into the sea, and bomb fragments could tear back toward the aircraft that had just released them. Even so, they kept coming after loss, because the low run hid them until the last stretch. Lord Craig later said 6 better fuses and Britain would have lost. Up to half of Argentine bombs failed to detonate, and at least 13 struck British ships without exploding. That failure with the fuses gave the landing force a narrow margin, and the next question was how much of the next raid could be cut away before release. Sea Harriers did not stop every low run, they thinned them out. Each kill meant one less aircraft over San Carlos, less bomb weight, or a formation missing its leader. On May 21st, as British troops went ashore at San Carlos, Sharkey Ward found another low dagger group over West Falkland. He fired one sidewinder. It hit the lead aircraft. Ward watched it cartwheel into the ground, and that attack reached the fleet already reduced. Later that day, Lieutenant Steve Thomas hit another dagger headed for the same landing zone. Ward later said the Argentines were brave and kept coming after so many losses. That was the point, not romance. 2 interceptions meant 2 fewer attackers pressing San Carlos. Both Argentine pilots ejected, both survived. The wake of the last interception still hung over San Carlos when another dagger group came in. From HMS Hermes, 800 Naval Air Squadron sent Lieutenant Commander Andy Old into the intercept. He shot down 2 daggers within minutes. That cut 2 attack runs from the landing fleet. Old received the Distinguished Service Cross, and XZ-457 became the top-scoring Sea Harrier of the war. Yet British air success had a limit. On June 8th, Flight Lieutenant David Morgan flew low over Choiseul Sound and saw it below. Under low cloud, smoke hung over Sir Galahad and Sir Tristram, and both landing ships were already burning. 4 A-4 Skyhawks of Group 5 still pressed toward Bluff Cove, but the lead aircraft had already released its bombs. Morgan, an RAF pilot on exchange with 800 Naval Air Squadron, climbed with Dave Smith and then dived from above. Morgan fired his sidewinders. 2 Skyhawks fell. Smith then destroyed a 3rd aircraft. The 4th, damaged, still made it home. Juan Araras, Danilo Bolzan, and Ensign Alfredo Vasquez died in the 3 lost jets. Morgan received the Distinguished Service Cross, but the timing mattered more than the medal because Argentine bombs had already hit the ships. His attack marked the last air-to-air victory of the war. 6 days later, the Argentine garrison at Port Stanley surrendered. That late intercept exposed the real issue. The argument came down to aircraft type. Mirage III crews judged the Sea Harrier against the wrong standard because their own fighter came from a different war. French designers built the Mirage III for Cold War interception in Europe. Its delta wing favored a fast climb to around 12 kilometers and a dash at Mach 2. The target sat near the Iron Curtain, a Soviet bomber. Get up fast, fire, and turn back. That mission rewarded speed, height, and a short burst of combat. The Sea Harrier came from another map. Britain built it for ship defense in the North Atlantic, from short decks, bad weather, and the end of a long supply line. Its vectored thrust let it leave small decks without catapults and return for another patrol. London treated naval fixed-wing aviation as a fading arm, but the Navy kept flying it. Over the islands, that old decision paid in time over the landing force and repeat sorties. Argentina had speed and numbers. Britain kept about 90% serviceability. Britain also had a missile that could take a target from any angle. Behind that edge stood 20 years of budgets, exercises, and dissimilar air combat sorties at Decimo Manu. Britain had paid for training that matched this war at sea. Those flights mixed unlike aircraft and turned peacetime practice into usable skill. Argentina had paid for a different fight. This was not a contest of better men, but of decisions made long before the islands. The first serious day of air combat made that plain. Captain Gustavo Garcia Cuerva, a brave and capable officer, died under fire from his own side in a Mirage built for another mission. First Lieutenant Carlos Perona ejected from his stricken Mirage and survived. Garcia Cuerva's body was never recovered. The campaign had already taken Lieutenant José Ardiles, cousin of footballer Osvaldo Ardiles, on the first day. On the British side, 6 Sea Harrier pilots died across the campaign. None died in dogfights. Lieutenant Nick Taylor of 800 Naval Air Squadron went down over Goose Green on May 4th, hit by anti-aircraft fire. 2 days later, Lieutenant Commander John Eaton Jones and Lieutenant Alan Curtis of 801 Naval Air Squadron vanished on a night sortie southeast of East Falkland. Poor visibility likely drove the two jets together. No wreckage surfaced. Lieutenant Commander Gordon Batt had already won the Distinguished Service Cross for the May 1st strike on Stanley Airfield. On May 23rd, his Sea Harrier crashed on takeoff from HMS Hermes and killed him. One loss came from ground fire. 2 likely came from weather and darkness. John Eaton Jones and Alan Curtis were never found. Behind that lost list stood a man who argued with the Navy for 42 years. Sharkey Ward died on May 17, 2024, aged 80. From the war to his death, he kept saying, loudly and inconveniently, that the Royal Navy could not lose carrier air power again. The fleet retired the Sea Harrier in 2006. The type had entered service in 1980. Ward called that a mistake. Late in the war, returning to Invincible from combat air patrol, he heard an Argentine pilot on open radio in Spanish telling his wingman to break off, go home, and live. Ward had fuel. He had a missile and the better angle, but he did not fire and let the pair go home. That decision outlived the war. Now, even the squadron boards at Yeovilton are starting to fade. The Sea Harrier pilots are old, and many are gone. Ward is gone, and Dave Morgan is gone. So the names come first, before the score. They still need saying aloud. Andy Old, Sharkey Ward, Steve Thomas, Paul Barton, Dave Morgan, Rod Fredrickson, Dave Smith, Tony Penfold, Mike Blissett, Clive Morrill, Brian Hale, Tim G., Gordon Batt, Nick Taylor, John Jones, Alan Curtis. Those numbers came from older choices about deck cycles, patrol time, and readiness, long before the shooting started. Sea Harrier pilots destroyed 20 Argentine aircraft in air combat, and they lost 0 Sea Harriers there. Argentina had speed. Britain had time.